Hey friends! Today we are going to work on absolute value. I did not write down your objective, so I'll tell you. Today you will understand that absolute value is a distance to zero. And you're going to talk about some real life experiences or real life situations where we use absolute value to describe things. So let's start off with, what is the definition? What is absolute value? Well, that is the number's distance from zero on a number line. So the absolute value of 3 is 3. Why? Because it is 3 units, 3 jumps, 3 spaces away from 0. So what we would say is the absolute value of -3 is 3. Okay? And the way it's written is, I like to call these like maybe jail cells, and we would say the absolute value of -3. That's what it looks like symbolically. So instead of having to write out the absolute value of -3, we just say this, and that is the absolute value of -3. Okay? So one way to think about it is, if you see those jail cells, if you see those 2 straight lines with the number in between, think in your head, all right, how far away is that number from 0? Or how far away is that number from freedom? If you want to think of 0 as freedom and you're in a jail cell, how far away are you from 0? Well, -4 is 4 away from 0. So the absolute value of -4 is 4. Okay, so as we look through these in your notes, let's think to ourselves, how far away is 85 from 0? Well, 85 is 85 away from 0. How far is -5 from 0? -5 is 5 steps from 0. How far away is -4.5 from 0? Well, it's just 4.5. And finally, how far is 2/3 from 0? It's 2/3. Are you noticing something? Are you noticing that it's just that number, but it's the positive of that number? Okay, 85 stayed a positive 85, and all of these negatives became positives, because if we're talking about a distance to 0, it's going to be a positive number. Okay, so the answer here is actually -6. You might be thinking, well, Mrs. Madsen, you just told me that if it's absolute value, it's positive. Yes, but we have the negative on the outside right there. So this, the absolute value of 6, is indeed 6. You're right. But because there's that negative sign on the outside, then the negative is on the outside as well. So that is an example where you might see an absolute value and still a negative in the answer. That's because the negative's not inside the jail cells, negative's on the outside. So we can compare absolute values with regular numbers. So what I would suggest doing is rewriting it with its actual value. So the absolute value of -8 is 8. Therefore, -8 is less than the absolute value of -8. Okay, so 13 compared to the absolute value of -13. Let's see, the absolute value of -13. -13 is 13 away from 0. That's an example of when they're both equal to each other. So let's find all the integers with an absolute value of 7. If I were to have a number inside here and the answer be 7, what would that number be? Well, obviously 7, because 7 is 7 away from 0. But there's also -7, isn't there? That's also 7 away from 0. So we could write the absolute value of 7 is equal to 7, or the absolute value of -7 is equal to 7, or both. They both have the same distance from 0, so they both have the same absolute value. So one way that you might be able to think of absolute value is, think of any number with the absolute value bars being put in a washing machine, and when something goes in a washing machine, it comes out clean, right? Whether it was already clean to go in to begin with, or if it was super dirty to begin with, it always comes out clean. And that's the same with absolute value. No matter what type of number goes inside the absolute value lines, it will always come out positive. Whether it's a negative number, it'll come out as a positive number. If it's a positive number, it will still come out as a positive number. Okay, so washing machine might work for you. But literally, if you just think how far away is that number from 0, that's what absolute value is. Okay, so what is the difference between absolute value of numbers and the opposite of numbers? Well, the opposite of 5 is 5, right? But the absolute value of -5 is also 5. That was a terrible example. Let me start over. The absolute value of 6 is 6. But the opposite of 6 is -6. Okay? So opposites can include negatives, but like we were just talking about with absolute values, no matter what, always come out positive. All right, here's your test for absolute value. Which of the following has a value less than 0? Well, if we write these out, the absolute value of 6 is 6. The absolute value of -6 is 6. -6 is just -6, and 6 is just 6. So the only one less than 0 is 0. All right, it's halftime. Now we're going to get a little super technical, and we're going to talk about, in real life, when do we use absolute value? And we actually do quite a bit. Anytime we're talking about depth or debt or distance, we use absolute value to talk about its distance to 0. Whether if we're talking about depth, we're talking about the distance to sea level. If we're talking about debt, we're talking about the distance to not owing anyone any money. And if we're talking about distance, we're talking about the distance to 0, correct? Let me give you an example. If I rode my unicycle 15 feet, but I did it backwards, plus instead of going forward from the start line, I was at the start line and I went backwards from the start line, I would say I went a distance of 15 feet, right? Even though I was going backwards and I was going away from the starting line, I would never say I went -15 feet, would I? Why? Because distance is always positive. Even if I'm going backwards, even if I'm going the opposite direction of wherever I'm supposed to be going, we're not going to say I went -5 feet or I went -7 miles. It's always I went 7 miles. Okay, so distance is always positive. Another example is debt. If you owe someone money, you have a balance of negative. Okay, so let's say I borrowed $30 from my mom. I could say two things. I could say I have a balance of -$30. That's my balance in my account, the money that I have, right? Or I could say I have a debt of $30. And that debt lets everyone know that I'm in the negatives, doesn't it? This is me. If you use the word debt, then we know you are 30 away from 0, aren't you? So you are in debt $30. You're at -30. But we say it positively. We don't say I'm in debt -$30 because you don't have to say the negative. If you use the word debt, we already know you're the negative distance from 0, aren't you? Okay. Now, my sister borrowed $50 from my mom. You could say she has a balance of -$50. You could also say that she has a debt of $50. So here's my question now. Who has the greater debt, me or my sister? Remember that I'm in debt $30. She's in debt $50. Who has the greater debt? My sister, doesn't she? Yeah, she has a further distance from 0 to go to get to being even and not owing any money. Here is an example with depth. Submarine A is at a depth of -12 feet. We could also say that submarine A is at a depth. Oh, wait, did I say that right? Submarine is at -12 feet in elevation is what I should have set up here. -12 feet in elevation. We could also say that submarine A is at a depth of 12 feet. You don't have to say a depth of -12 feet because, again, when we're talking about depth, we know that depth is already below 0. It's already in negative elevation, okay? Submarine A is at, you could either say it's at -6 feet or it's at a depth of 6 feet. So which one is at a greater depth, meaning which one is further from 0? Which one has a greater absolute value? Submarine A is at a greater depth because it is further from 0. Okay, the depth is greater. It's further from 0. One more example. While scuba diving, Amelia explored the ocean at an elevation of negative 30 feet. This is Amelia. Now, Ricardo was closer to the surface. We know that zero, oh, I want that to be like water. We know that the surface is at 0 degrees sea level, or 0 feet, okay? So, if Ricardo was closer to the surface of the water than Amelia, which describes Ricardo's depth? So Ricardo is somewhere from the surface to here, right? Ricardo is somewhere in there. So is his depth greater than Amelia, greater than 30 feet, or is his depth less than 30 feet, less than Amelia? Well, his depth is less than 30 feet because he's closer to the surface. So he's not as far away from 0. I hope that gives you something to think about as we're talking about distance to 0. Now, when you hear the word depth or debt or distance, you know that we're actually talking about a distance to 0. See you guys later. Have fun in your practice.